Good morning. From their perspective of their strategic importance to the company, the six capitals are unique strategic resources and critical to the company's long-term value creation. As stewards of the enterprise, we need to learn how to protect them and how to create value by deploying these scarce and individualized resources effectively. However, before we take a deep dive into each of the six capitals, I wanted to present some context in two areas. First, I'd like to tell you a little about the history of the growth of the sustainability movement around the world in corporate boardrooms. From the perspective of triple bottom line reporting, that is people, planet, and profit, and as well from the stakeholders' perspective and their focus on ESG, that is the environmental, social, and governance contribution that the enterprise makes to the society. I'd like to discuss these a little more. I think the history and the context behind this is critically important because sustainability and the global movement for sustainability has only been around 15 to 20 years. And you're really coming into the next generation of the critical importance of sustainability and discussion of sustainability in the corporate boardrooms. But second, I also want to recap our presentation on sustainability and what constitutes a sustainable company. I want to clarify a little better how we define a sustainable company. Again, this is like fuzzy math. It's not been perfectly quantified. However, this still remains the basis of our understanding of how, as advisors, compliance experts, and corporate stewards, we could contribute to value creation of the corporate enterprise as we identify, manage, measure, and report on the six capitals. So let's first review our understanding of what constitutes a sustainable company. As we discussed, our understanding still lacks definitional clarity of what a sustainable company is. And also, we really are not totally certain how we can measure value creation. From my perspective, behind this movement is an inference, and this is a critical inference. A more socially responsible company that practices an ethic of sustainability will carry higher value, deliver greater performance, and achieve longer-term stability. My focus, of course, is from our perspective as corporate stewards, legal compliance executives, risk managers, and outside legal advisors. I think we need to acknowledge that sustainability from a corporate enterprise perspective is also a critically important growth area. Some professionals, in fact, view sustainability as the new practice development opportunity. They realize that sustainability skills, the skills that hopefully you'll take with you from this class, offer innovative, creative, and entrepreneurial abilities and opportunities to develop firm expertise in this new practice growth area, and offers as well new employment opportunities. Investors and the public who seek additional non-financial information about a company will embrace this new creative practice development opportunity. So let's take a look at what we could define as the sustainable company. Again, the definitions are a bit unclear. We look to Michael Creighton, of course, as one of the professors who's spent a great deal of his time looking at sustainability and sustainability reporting initiatives. According to Creighton, sustainability is the nexus of financial, social, and environmental factors that impact an entity's ability to ensure its long-term survival. And of course, we discussed some of these. Intellectual capital, workforce loyalty, and a reputation for social responsibility all present valuable intangible assets that, of course, don't appear on a balance sheet or under GAAP, but significantly impact sustainability. In order to address these factors, entities must consider an extremely broad array of stakeholders. For example, an entity's customer, supply chain vendors, local community residents, government representatives, all impact its reputation and thus also must be addressed by the organization. Thus, each entity is not simply responsible for its own sustainable future, it shares responsibility for the sustainable futures of its communities and society as well. For example, consider the complicated interrelationships. We talked about this a little before between General Motors, its suppliers, its labor union, and the city of Detroit. Of course, I define the sustainable enterprise as the information that does not appear on the balance sheet. I call it the unbalanced sheet approach. Most corporate enterprise value, as we discussed, is not on its books. What is counted often does not matter. What matters is often not counted. That the most important assets and liabilities are not recorded on the balance sheet of any enterprise. An entity's intellectual property, its brand equity, its patents, its trademarks, inventions, goodwill, historic reputation, critical mass, R&D, quality of management. Again, these are incredibly difficult to measure, but they absolutely have to be considered in terms of the value creation of the entity. On the other hand, the most important liabilities, ones that can seize the market and lead to global crises. For example, inadequate reserves to cover liquidity crunches, derivatives, off-balance sheet financing, repurchase agreements with no reserves booked against them, investments in offshore subsidiaries, publicly traded companies use to tighten up their quarterly reporting. Now, could these categories of liabilities be measured? Can you identify them as corporate stewards in terms of their risk to an enterprise's sustainability? A third example of definition of a sustainable company is best explained by example. Most would agree that wind and solar power represent sustainable energy sources. But are the companies that provide this power really economically sustainable? What happens if government subsidies lapse? What happens when oil prices dropped, as they recently did, to about 50% in less than a year? And finally, I think we have to remind ourselves, and we talked a little about this ourselves, but as we go into the analysis of the six capitals, let's keep it in the back of our minds. The definition of sustainable or sustainable company is suggested by Thomas Friedman in Hot, Flat, and Crowded 2.0. The author describes companies who practice an ethic of sustainability, institutes that are too good to fail and too strong to fail, not institutions that are too big to fail. But then again, as the observers of the behavior of corporate entities, as the corporate compliance, the stewards, the fiduciaries of these entities, we're, of course, in a best position to observe this, but how do we define a good company? Let's take, for example, Fannie and Freddie, and we talked about this. Fannie and Freddie Mac were formed during the Great Depression to help ensure that every American could afford a home. That is what most would consider a good mission, a sustainable mission. So why did these enterprises prove to be unsustainable in the long run? Of course, Fannie and Freddie's leverage, their debt to equity ratio, was 5 times the average leverage of other financial institutions, and that drove them into bankruptcy. But at what point, if you were working for Fannie and Freddie, would you have concluded that this is no longer a sustainable company? The question that we're going to have to ask ourselves going into the future, and the fundamental question, and probably the debate that will continue to ensue, is whether in our current environment of regulatory overload and the litigious basis of our society, whether any professional with any degree of certainty or competency can assure the stakeholders and the public and the investors that this is a sustainable enterprise. As fiduciary stewards and executives of the corporation, do we have the knowledge, training, tools, and techniques to develop a sustainable reporting model that will be able to identify companies like this? I'm kind of hoping through this session and through these series of sessions, we'll at least gain an understanding of what it is we need to understand to identify, measure, monitor, and report on the sustainable company.